Welcome folks to our next lesson on aircraft performance. This is Skybound on the Ground with Michael Lombard, and we are in Chapter 10 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And today we are talking about takeoff and landing performance. Now, most aviation-related accidents happen during these two phases of flight, so it would behoove us to learn what we can and can't expect from our airplanes in terms of takeoff and landing performance, so that we don't become one of those statistics. Now, it really all starts, the place we have to start with, is how much distance it takes for our airplane to get off the ground. Once you get off the ground, then you have to start talking about climb performance and stuff like that, and we'll deal with more with that in the next lesson. But how much distance is it going to take for my airplane to take off, and how long is it a runway? Because if I don't have enough runway to get my airplane off the ground, you just better forget it, otherwise you're going to end up in the weeds or the trees or something at the end of the runway, and it's not going to be pretty. So how do we figure out how takeoff and landing distances are affected? Well, we actually started learning about some of the factors that affect our takeoff and landing distances in the last lesson. And you remember, it has something to do with stuff like density, altitude, the pressure that we have in our atmosphere, and the temperature. Well, let's take a look here. Let's put our airplane down at sea level again. So there is the nice waves, and here's our airplane. And runway is really not supposed to be that sloped, but okay. So airplane down here, and let's say it's just a standard day down at sea level, and it'll take our airplane this much runway to get it off the ground. Okay, let's make it a little bit shorter. It actually will do a little bit better. So it'll take this much runway to get off the ground. What happens when you take the airplane up to a higher altitude? That means the atmospheric pressure is less, so the air density is less as well. So up here we are in the mountains now, and we have our airplane at a nice mountain strip. And more mountains over there at the end. So instead of taking that much distance for the airplane to take off, it's going to take a lot longer for it to accelerate because that propeller isn't as efficient, the engine's not producing as much power, and the wings won't produce as much lift at the same speed, so you have to fly the airplane faster in order to get enough lift for it to take off. So all those factors combine to make a much longer takeoff roll, and so it'll take longer to get off the runway. Got to make sure that you have enough room between where you take off and maybe the mountains at the very end. So that's what happens when you take the airplane up to a higher altitude. But it's not just air pressure that affects it's not just altitude that affects the air density. There was another factor that we learned about. That's right, temperature. So we're back at the beach here, and it's a hot day instead of the cold standard conditions that we had before. And what does that do to air density? It makes air density less. And so the airplane actually feels as if it is at a higher altitude. It might actually feel as if it's all the way up in the mountains. And so the airplane is going to fly just as if it was up in the mountains because it is experiencing a high density altitude because of the temperatures. So that means that this airplane, instead of taking this much distance to get off the ground and into the air, it might take this much distance to get off and into the air. So altitude and temperature, so air pressure, temperature, these things combine to decrease or increase our takeoff rolls. What about weight of an airplane? That's kind of self-explanatory. If you have a heavy airplane, it's going to take longer for you to get that thing accelerated. And if you have a light airplane, it'll get off the ground in a much shorter time as well. So weight has a factor. Oh yes, and when you have a heavier airplane, it's going to also have to fly at a faster speed in order to be supported in the air. So that's another thing that is going to increase your takeoff roll. To be able to get to that sufficient flying speed. There's something else that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the surface of the runway that we're taking off from. So let's say that the standard that they use the figures in your pilot's handbook is going to be a dry, smooth, level, hard-surfaced runway. that is the ideal. But guess what? There are other types of runways out there. You might be taking off on a runway that has all sorts of weeds, and it might be some sort of grass runway. And how do you think that's going to affect your airplane's acceleration capabilities? Well, if you're bouncing along out there and you have wet grass or something like that, that's going to slow you down. Anything that is not that paved, level, dry, smooth runway is going to impede your ability to accelerate the airplane, and hence it's going to take more distance to take off. And this also affects your landing distance as well. It might actually help you slow down a little bit more. But what about if you have a wet runway? Wet runways really can throw a curveball at you, especially if you don't have a grooved runway, because grooved runways help spread the water out and drain it off the runway, but not a lot of runways are like that, and so you might run into something called hydroplaning. First of all, the first situation you will encounter is that, well, you're going along and you have water kind of standing on the runway there from the rain, and it kind of builds up in front of the wheel, and that just kind of hinders you from being able to accelerate the plane as quickly as you want, because you got this stuff slowing you down. So that's going to increase your takeoff roll. But once you get to a certain speed, then you also can start hydroplaning, and that's where the wheel itself actually lifts up off the ground. It's no longer touching the surface of the runway, and instead you have this film of water that it's riding on. And folks, you have no more directional control from your landing gear, and you have no braking control either. So this especially becomes a consideration when you are trying to land, because you come down and you set down, and if you're at such a speed that the airplane starts hydroplaning, you can't use your brakes to slow you down. It's going to take you a lot longer to get the airplane down to stopped speed. It's kind of like being on ice. And hey, there are ice runways as well, but we're not going to go there today. So hydroplaning speed is very simple to calculate. You just times 9 by the square root of your tire pressure in PSI. So if you have 36 PSI, that means 9 times 6. That would be 54 knots would be the very actually low speed at which your airplane would start hydroplaning. So you got to take that into consideration. If you're approaching a wet runway, you might have the airplane. First of all, it's not going to brake as well because it's a slick runway, but also if you happen to start hydroplaning, you're going to take a lot longer distance to get the airplane stopped. Wet runways take long, also keep you from taking off in a shorter distance. So think about the runway conditions. You might also have something like runway slope. So, perfect world, every runway is completely level, but this is not a perfect world, and I'm not a perfect artist either, and you would notice that it kind of has a little bit of a wave in it. Let me put a little bit more. There are some runways in the world that are actually sloped uphill significantly, and the amount of slope that you have is called the runway gradient, and it'll be given to you in percentage. So if you have a 3% slope, that means that for every 100 feet, it slopes up 3 feet vertically. So that's kind of a significant slope, and I guess in Papua New Guinea they have something sometimes up to 15% slope gradients, which is crazy. But obviously you would want to land going uphill. If you landed going downhill, then you would actually, you have now this downhill thing that you're having to overcome. If you've ever ridden your bike downhill, you know that it's harder to stop the bike. If you land going uphill, it's going to be easier to stop your airplane. So slope is going to be a consideration. Actually, the airport that I fly out of, Auburn Airport, has a little bit of a slope to it, and we notice that when we're landing on runway 25 because we have this downhill effect, and so it does affect how much room we take when we land the airplane. And okay, so now takeoff considerations. We're going to start getting practical here and start looking at some actual numbers and stuff. If you want to get your airplane off the ground, obviously you want to accelerate that airplane as quickly as possible, and you're going to go full throttle. How much room you take off in, it really depends on stuff as, well, your weight, and also how much thrust you have compared to how much weight your airplane weighs, so this thrust to weight ratio. Now, there are a lot of training airplanes that have a rather low thrust to weight ratio, like the Cessna 150. It might have only 100 horsepower, and that means that, and this airplane is really actually quite underpowered, so you got to be ready and expecting that you're going to have some, you're going to notice some decreases in performance when you change certain factors. So the 150, it is a lower powered plane, but it also takes off in quite short distances, at least according to the airplane manual. So let's say that this airplane will take off in 500 feet. And let me draw a smaller airplane because that does not look like 500 feet. Okay, so here is our little Cessna 150. And let's say it takes off in 500 feet under normal conditions. So 500 feet right there. What does changing the weight do to our takeoff distance? Well, if you have a heavier plane, it'll take longer for it to accelerate. You'll have to take off at a higher speed, so it'll end up it'll burn up more runway in the process. Well, just to illustrate how much a factor this can be for a low-powered airplane, let's say we had our airplane loaded at 1,454 pounds, and max gross weight is 1,600 pounds, and so 1,454, it'll take off in 500 feet, but today we needed to take on a little bit more weight, so we're going to load it all the way up to 1,600 pounds. So we basically increased its total weight by 10%, and increasing the total weight by 10% had the effect of increasing the takeoff distance by 30%. Whoa! Okay, so instead of taking 500 feet to take off, it's going to take us a total of 700 feet now. And so you can see that, especially with low-powered airplanes, with low thrust to weight ratio, any increase in weight is going to have a big effect, and as well as the other factors that we have. So that is actually why when they give you the numbers in your pilot's operating handbook, they give you all the numbers when the airplane was flown at maximum gross weight, or at least calculated at what the airplane should perform at maximum gross weight. But here is the caveat. That was when the airplane was brand new and being flown by a professional test pilot, and the figures were put into the book by PR personnel. So you are actually not going to get the very optimistic numbers that the Pilot's Operating Handbook advertises. You're going to have to find out by experience, and safe experience, exactly what your airplane gives you. But it just gives you a starting point where you can start figuring things out from, and it also shows you the principles of how stuff is affected. And so what I've often seen pilots do is they will go out and test fly their own airplane and just under various conditions and see how things work, and they figure out, okay, well, I just need to add 20% to the aircraft, to the Pilot's Operating Handbook figures, or some correction factor that they've figured out for their particular airplane. Okay, so that is what happens when you increase the weight. But there's another factor that we have not talked about yet that can either help or impede our takeoff performance, as well as our landing performance. What do you think that is? Well, just think back to aerodynamics class. And does that help you? Yeah, okay, so that is right. Wind. Wind actually helps, or it can also impede our takeoff performance, depending on where it's blowing from. From whence blows the wind? Let's take a look at our airplane on the ground. Remember that you have to have air flowing over the wings in order for the plane to fly, and really the wings don't care if the airplane is moving forward in relation to the ground. All they care is that you have air flowing over the wings. So you could actually have, say, 10 knots of breeze that is flowing. So 10 knots of breeze. And if you looked at your airspeed indicator and it could register that low, you would actually see that the airspeed indicator is registering 10 knots. And so if you couldn't see outside the airplane, you would think, oh, we're flying along, we're going along at 10 knots, but you're actually sitting still. That's because of the wind that's flowing over the airplane. And so how this affects your takeoff performance is that, hey, if the airplane is got this head start of 10 knots, that means we only have to accelerate to 50 knots ground speed, and we will be seeing 60 knots on the airspeed indicator. And if our takeoff speed is 60 knots, that means we can get the airplane off before we even had to get it all the way to 60 knots on the ground. That's kind of a confusing concept, but just remember, what you are doing is you're looking at your airspeed indicator, and when it shows you at proper flying airspeed, and that is how much air is flowing over the wings, that's when you're able to take off. So if you have a headwind, that has already given you a head start. Opposite is true. If you've got wind from behind you, it actually takes away from, it's kind of like negative airspeed, you could say. And so you actually would have to accelerate the plane to a faster speed in relation to the ground in order to get the same takeoff, in order to be able to take the airplane off. So let's see how having a headwind can affect our takeoff performance. And let's put our airplane on the ground here on the runway, getting ready to take off. So we're right over here. Okay, and so if you have a 7-knot headwind, let's say our airplane takes off at 70 knots, and we're going to have a wind that is 10% of that speed, so a 7-knot headwind. Now, under normal conditions, with no wind, this airplane is able to take off in, say, 500 feet. And here, let me just do this. It's nice that I have an eraser. I can correct things on the go, on the fly, per se. Okay, so 500 feet. That's how long that's how much distance the airplane would normally use to take off when there's no wind. But now we have a 7-knot headwind, so that's giving us more airspeed. The airplane is going to use up less distance in its takeoff roll. And guess what? A wind that is 10% of your takeoff speed is going to reduce your total takeoff roll by about 19%. And I know these numbers are kind of hard to remember, so just bear with me. You don't necessarily need to remember them because you'll be referencing your aircraft handbook, but this is just a rule of thumb. And so we can just, for illustration purposes, now we see that, hey, the airplane will actually be able to take off in about 400 feet instead of 500 feet, just because we have the wind blowing in our face. So always make sure you take off with the wind in your face. What happens if you try to take off with the wind behind you? That's actually going to increase your takeoff roll significantly. And the same is also true if you're landing the airplane. So let's say we are coming down for a landing, and we're going to use the same numbers again. It takes about 500 feet to stop this airplane on the ground once you touch down. And that's under normal conditions. But today we have a 7-knot tailwind. And so we're saying this is 10% of our landing speed. We land at 70 knots. So we get down on the ground, and we have this tailwind that's pushing us along, and it's making it hard for us to stop. And how much does this increase our landing roll? It increases it by about 21%. So both of them, you know, if you have wind from the front, that'll decrease it by about 20% if you have 10% of your takeoff speed, and if you have 10% of your landing speed from behind you, that'll increase your landing roll by about 20% as well. So it's kind of equal on both sides. That was what I'm trying to illustrate by all these percents. So sorry, don't get bogged down by that. Okay, so that means that your airplane is going to take 600 feet to get it stopped. And that can become significant if you have a short runway and you don't have that much room. And let us just take a look at this practically. This was a really interesting example that I really enjoyed reading from the book. and this is in the in Chapter 10 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. They gave this example of an airplane that is at an airport, and he's getting ready to land on runway 18. So he's in the traffic pattern, and there's an intersecting runway, so he's flying along, and he's getting to this point. He's going to land on this runway over here, and then suddenly the tower controller calls him up and says, hey, November 2845 Yankee, could you accept a landing clearance for runway 27? And he's like, sure, let's do it. We can do it. Okay, thank you. Cleared to land on runway 27, November 254 Yankee. I don't know if that was even the same call sign that used in the first place. Okay, so what he did is he starts turning towards the runway, and he was already really close. And so this runway, to start off with, was 3,500 feet long. 3,500 feet long, and the airplane, he's coming in, and because he was so close, he ended up, as he was trying to descend towards the runway, he ended up using up the first 1,000 feet of that runway, just getting down towards the ground. And so instead of 3,500 feet of runway to use once you land to get things stopped, he has only 2,500 feet left to work with. Now, on a normal day, he knows that this airplane should be able to get stopped in 1,600 feet. So that gives you plenty of room. 1,600 feet, that means there's about 900 feet left that you can work with. But, actually, no, let me correct that again. Yeah, that's correct. 1,600 feet. But today, he was diving towards the runway, and in the process, he was flying too fast, and so he comes in kind of hot. Instead of being at his approach speed of 70 knots, he's at 80 knots. And so as he touches the ground, that means that he now has more kinetic energy. It's going to take a lot. It's going to take more to get this airplane stopped, and so that adds on another 300 feet. So instead of 1,600 feet to get this airplane stopped, it's going to take 1,900 feet. And so now you have only about 600 feet left to work with over here. It's getting close, and guess what? We have another factor. Today, the wind is blowing at 10 knots from behind, and that further increases his landing roll by another about 300 feet, and so now he only has, finally, he has 260 feet left between when his airplane should be able to get stopped and the very end of the runway. And guess what? There was one more thing that they threw in, and today was a kind of rainy day, and the runway was wet. And so he touches down at his high speed, just below 80 knots, and his hydroplaning speed was about 54 knots, and so he is hydroplaning down the runway, and now there is really no hope of getting that plane stopped before he gets to the end, and so he is off into the weeds at the very end. Embarrassing at the very least, and expensive and even dangerous on the other end of the spectrum. So folks, it is important to know what your plane is going to do under the various circumstances, under the conditions that are out there in the real world. Remember, your pilot's operating handbook will show you stuff that is ideal, and you might be tempted to just go by those numbers right there, but there's always going to be some factors that they show you. For a wet runway, add this much percent distance for landing, and for a tailwind, add this much percent, and stuff like that. So you have to put all the factors together, and when you are looking at takeoff and landing performance, you need to look at a bunch of factors, and so you should use some sort of a process, some sort of a flow that you put things together, where, well, first of all, you got to see what the density altitude is going to do to your airplane. How high does your airplane feel that it's flying at? Because that is the way your airplane is going to actually perform. So density, altitude, and then you have to also consider the weight of the airplane. How much does the airplane weigh? And I should just write in block letters so that you guys can actually see. So let me just rewrite here. Okay, so yeah, density altitude. If you have a high density altitude, the airplane is going to perform worse. And if you have a heavy weight, the airplane is going to perform worse. And what about the wind? Which direction is the wind coming from? Do you have a headwind? That's going to help you out. It's going to give you a head start. If you have a tailwind, that's going to be bad for you. And what about the runway? What about the runway surface, the slope, the runway conditions, and what type of a runway it is, and how hard it is, all those factors. So you got to put these all together and come up with a realistic picture of how much distance your airplane is going to take off or to land. And then once you have that picture in mind, you can go out and go and fly your airplane and avoid those runways that are not adequate for your purposes. So we are going to start looking at the actual charts in the next lesson. So make sure you join us back for the next edition of Skybound on the Ground, because we're going to start putting this into even more practical terms. So see you next time.